Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Tech Talks Theatre. That is a mouthful to say. I haven't learnt after a day and a half here. We are joined next by a conversation about community, which I will introduce very shortly. But a couple of just housekeeping. If you want to ask any questions, you can join via the web browser, via this link over here. And you can join the session and ask any questions via that link. Alternatively, we can also take in-person questions at the end. So it's fine if you want to save them and ask Ashley yourself. But without further ado, I want to introduce the next session, which is Events+Community. How can events organizers maximize the value of online community? And it's the wonderful Ashley, founder of Guild. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. So we've got half an hour, and I'm going to rattle through these slides. By the way, if you want a copy of these slides, because it's quite small there, and there's some various charts and diagrams, then you can come up afterwards and give me a card, or connect on LinkedIn, or even on Guild. So I'm going to talk about why is community such a hot topic right now, because I think it is. What's the value of community for media and events businesses? Talk about what I think the different kinds of event community are. Talk about data a bit, and then just some sort of helpful resources at the end. So why is community so hot right now? And it was interesting, job titles, I think, or changing job titles are often leading indicators of trends and change. And this was in TechCrunch recently, saying the Chief Community Officer maybe is the new CMO. I don't think that's actually, in the tech world, it's happening a little bit. But still, it is an indicator of change. The most obvious answer is that having lived through a period of enforced isolation, that we have as humans a desire to connect and reconnect. So this is part of the reason why we've got this sort of swing back towards community. But it's not the only reason. There are some sort of bigger underlying trends at play here. One of these is about trust. So broadly speaking, and this is research from Edelman, who've been studying trust over sort of 20 years and how that's the sources of trust, why we trust, who we trust. And broadly, trust has migrated away from institutions, government, police, banks, towards individuals and peers, friends and family, and in the professional context, colleagues, people we know. So people are seeking out community as a source of trusted information and advice. Data is another one. So if you're in marketing, you will certainly know about this, but the whole kind of cookie death thing, Apple's change in privacy policy, GDPR and privacy regulation, all mean that it's got much harder to get hold of customer data. And even indeed in social media, a lot of the social media activity has gone into dark social now, as in social, which you can't track. Most obviously messaging apps like WhatsApp. You've got no visibility on that data. So one of the reactions, one of the reasons community again is hot is the marketing, sales, customer service people are looking for new sources of data that they own and control. There's a few other trends as well. This whole, there's a lot of talk again in, marketing and branding around purpose and authenticity, particularly important in Millennial and Gen Z. They want brands to have an emotional connection, not just a transactional connection with organizations. Also, and particularly the pandemic made this worse, to be honest, in digital, there's just so much noise, like on LinkedIn and Twitter. There's toxic behavior as well, but it's just overwhelming. And so getting any kind of cut through is really hard. And finally as well, there's this economic shift towards the passion economy or the creator economy, where people maybe have a portfolio of roles, they have a side hustle on the side. All of these things mean that communities and connections and these hubs of people you know and are able to connect with is becoming more and more important. So if we say, okay, that's fine, but what about if we're running events, media businesses, what more specifically is the value of community? Interestingly, here's just a number of examples from the last few years of where tech companies are buying communities, like literally going out and acquiring the communities that they sell to or serve. And the data shows that of the fastest growing technology companies out there, almost half of them, 48%, have their own communities, and they're growing much faster than the others who don't have their own communities. So the tech world, which tends to be a little bit more sophisticated and advanced than many other sectors, they are entirely, literally bought into this idea of having an owned community as a route to market being very powerful. As for event organizers, this was a poll done earlier in the year of a bunch of independent event organizers in the UK. And they were asked, aside from the return to offices, meetings and live events, what's your biggest challenge? And what came out top was building a truly engaged, valuable community. They were then asked, what's your biggest opportunity? And they said, building a truly engaged, valuable community. So quite clearly, event organizers are thinking, well, this community thing is a great opportunity, but it's also quite a great challenge. And we can maybe talk about why the challenge is later. So tactically, what can community deliver for an event organizer? Well, most obviously, event attendance, driving footfall, getting people to turn up to things like this. And there's, evidence. This was from a recent event, actually an online event, 436 people, of which almost half came via promotion in the community associated with the event. So there's evidence that community drives event attendance. But it's also about extending the value of the event before and after. So the reality is probably you here actually thought about this event in any seriousness at the beginning of this week when you looked at your calendars, and then in real seriousness, maybe yesterday evening, most probably this morning on the way in, and you'll probably forget about it once you go home today, or it'll last about a day or two. But what happens if you could extend that experience and extend the value and those connections and the learning and sponsors value as well? You can do that via online community, obviously. Sponsor revenue. Increasingly, communities are starting to be sponsored. This is good news for them because they get awareness a year round, not just on a day like this or 2 days. They get year-round lead generation opportunities as well. And for people, if you're doing event planning or there's a content part to your business, you get amazing insights and content out of community. You get speakers, you get awards judges, you get panelists, you get moderators. And data, which we'll come back to, but I mentioned this before, but some really valuable and interesting data. So that's tactically, but strategically, I think the bigger thing, and this is what the C-suite, the board and whatever, or owners of businesses, I think, why they're looking at community so much, is this move towards this 365 year-round engagement model, and also to more recurring revenue models. A lot of event organizers got hammered with COVID, obviously, and they think, I don't want that to happen again, so we need to build a business model which is a bit more resilient and a bit more ongoing. Essentially what it is, like if you've got an event-focused business, your sort of rhythm or operating model or your ability to create money is very spiky. It goes event, on to the next one, event, on to the next one, event. But what they want to move towards is something more like this. So you still have the events, but you've got also this ongoing engagement with the community kind of year-round, which can provide year-round value rather than relying just on the events. And this, the data shows these two data sources. You can see, if not the detail, the shape. This is for B2B trade shows like this, exhibitions. It went up to 2019, crashed with the pandemic, same here, massive drop, and it's bouncing back. Look, it's bouncing back, which is great, except that the future says it's going to dip down again and end up at pre-pandemic levels. This are the predictions. So there's still strategically a need to go, yeah, fine, it's all back to normal now, but it isn't forever. And there's still challenges, say, around keeping this customer engagement, getting cut through on your marketing to get people to turn up to events. This is from the CMO of the Financial Times. Community is the next phase of media. So this is looking at it not just from an event perspective, but media more generally. People want a sense of participation and belonging. Events can be maybe a bit too transactional in nature. And engagement is our North Star metric for predicting lifetime value. So strategically, this is really key. If you can get people engaged, the FT obviously is mostly based on subscriptions they're trying to get, but so that recurring revenue model. But again, even for event organizers, if you can get that engagement, that's probably your best, community being a big part of that, your best predictor of future success. So you think, okay, well, so who's doing this well? Tech companies, as I said, are doing events and community and content, blending that pretty well, like CMO by Adobe, HubSpot's community, CFO Connect, which is from Spendesk, Drift Insider. There's media businesses, particularly community-led ones, not surprisingly, doing community and events, combining them well. And here's some example: CMX, Sales Hacker, Mind the Product. Although worth making the point that all of those have now been bought by tech companies, the ones that are doing it well. Membership organizations are pretty good at this, actually, because they're used to having members and engaging with their members. Event businesses, I'm being a bit tough, but none spring to mind, frankly. Events businesses, organizers say they have a community. I'm not convinced they do. I think they have an audience, but not a community mostly. So if you've got ideas of people you think are doing this incredibly well, then let me know. But I would say it's not being done that well yet. So here's a thing which I think is really important to think about, is the different types of community and what might be appropriate depending on your kind of your business model. So let's say you're in engineering sector and you have, let's say, a core community. This is a year-round community for engineers. It's called, I don't know, Future of Engineering or the Engineering Forum or the Engineers Collective. I don't know, but it isn't the event brand. It's a core year-round community. Now, you might have, depending on how diversified your model is, we've got events, which we'll come back to, but you also might have content if you're a media business. You might have training and e-learning and e-courses if you're doing that, and campaigns, so like initiatives and lobbying and things like that. So let's just look at how communities might be used just for events, but bear in mind the same would apply to these other three areas. So you can have what I would call an embedded events community. So this is where you're saying, no, let's set up a standalone community for the event brand. Let's just drop the event community element into the existing community. It's just a temporary spike in the community. There's a buzz that comes up around the event and then it goes away again. But that's fine because the community is in a year-round thing anyway, talking about probably trends and best practice and news. And there's some pros and cons of an embedded events community. Most obviously, it's very easy. You don't need to set up something else. You just drop something in. But then it might be a bit too noisy to combine all the event chit-chat with all the general chit-chat and things. So there's some pros and cons. Then you've got what we call the pop-up events community. So this is a temporary community, but it is focused around the event brand. I'll give an example in a minute. But I would argue, like, for an event like this, it might be hard to get year-round engagement on this event. Because they say, we as the audience, attendees, sponsors, we don't think about it and frankly don't care about it all year round. It's really hard to keep up engagement around an event brand year round. Whereas it's not so hard to have a core community that's year round. So a pop-up one's just saying, look, let's just recognize that. Let's create a community for a month before the event and 2 weeks after. Or depending on the nature of the event, 3 months before and a week after, or a week before and a week after. But the point is you're setting expectations, saying this community is just for the event, and we know you're not going to pay attention all year round, so let's focus it just in temporary. And then finally, you do have the standalone events community. So this is a community which is based around the event brand, and it does exist year round in an ongoing way, like the core community. So I'd say those are the kind of three options. And I don't think people think about it in this way as much as they should do. And just to give you some examples, so an embedded events community, this is on Guild. The Marketing Society, a customer of ours, they have their Marketing Society coffee house, which is for their members, about 500 members. It's a year-round place for their members to ask each other questions, share, learn, etc. And they had recently a one-day conference, the Global Changemakers Ignite conference. And they just created a mega thread, so there's a single conversation thread to talk about that one-day event. And it was really just a spike of activity like a day or two before and a day or two after, and on the day itself. And you can see here there's like 38 messages posted, 31 photos, 5 links, and 22 delegates mentioned. So that's an embedded community. This is an example of a pop-up event community. So this was for a sort of senior exec summit for people in the media business in Berlin, about 100 attendees, so quite small, 2 days, quite focused on networking. And this was only live for a week before and a week after, so really quite short. And in here we had 60% of those 100 people join the community, 33 conversations, 100 connections made via the community, and almost 270 direct messages sent. So a lot of the value actually is one-to-one direct, not just in the group setting. So this was just a week before and a week after. That's a pop-up one. The bit, to be honest, I struggle with is the standalone events community. Because I think to keep people's interest in what is in their minds an event experience maybe year-round is quite hard. Bigger events, and here I just picked up 2, I know, like the Cannes Festival of Creativity and Cannes Lions, which is once a year. Like if I went to their website and took this screenshot, it happened back in June, I think it was. And all it says now is, you know, what's new for 2023? Join us next June as the creative community reunites to focus on the future. Like they're so event focused, they're not even thinking about a year-round community. There's like, we talk about community, but what we really mean is tip up to our event next June. And even the Web Summit, which you'd think would be, you know, it's sort of more techy, a bit more progressive. It's like, that's a wrap. See you next November. It's like, there's no community there, quite clearly. Now, maybe they're right. Maybe it's quite hard to. I'd say they're probably big enough brands. And if the Web Summit had a year-round community which was like tech entrepreneurs or startups to scale-ups or tech futures or something like that, that should succeed and be very powerful for helping with their event. So standalone event communities, I say, are a bit harder to do. And I think that's sometimes the problem is event organizers assume they're going to have a community that's wrapped around their event brand, whereas I'd argue they should have a separate standalone year-round one, which is just about the core issues within their industry or sector, and then have possibly a pop-up community around the events that they run. So data. These are 2 interesting comments I belong to a community of event organizers. Just literally in the last couple of weeks. Reg data is out of date and unreliable shortly after the event. Don't tell the sponsors. In this hybrid world, people are using personal data to register for events rather than business data. So the data is all a bit messy and mucky, and people lie when they fill in the things anyway. So there's a bit of a challenge, and it's got worse with the kind of accuracy and completeness of delegate data. Whereas in communities, people have some kind of profile. So you've got information about, you know, job titles and names and businesses and things if it's B2B. You can get behavioral data. So I won't go in detail, but that pop-up community I mentioned earlier, we could track the number of connections being made, but also the direct messages being sent plotted over time, which is interesting to see, again, when are people most active or receptive to the event. And the answer is, I say, a day or 2 before and a day or 2 afterwards, as you might expect. But even more interestingly, sentiment data. So we have a community on Guild, was called Creo, now called Events 365. But we mined the conversations between these event organizers over a period of a year and a half. And it spat out, you won't be able to read this from there, but it spat out like a leaderboard of all the event tech suppliers, most of whom are here today. And we had data not only on how many times they were mentioned, but also the sentiment. So how positively or negatively did people feel about that? So Hopin, for example, good old Hopin, was mentioned the most. Not surprisingly, given their stratospheric funding journey. But sentiment, not so great. Zoom, not surprisingly, was mentioned a lot. But if you go down to like, when in fact I was looking opposite there, Hubilo, I never know it's Hubilo or Hubilo, but anyway, they have done really well on positive sentiment. They haven't got any negative sentiment, actually. but they're not talked about quite so much. This is super valuable. If I was any of these, this is what their customers or prospects are saying about them in a community. And then we could drill down and look at, okay, for Remo, for example, what do people think about the networking opportunities on Remo? Actually pretty good. Q&A functionality, not so good. Breakout rooms, how user-friendly these things are, all driven by what people are saying in the community. And then again, we had to drill down into Hopin, because that was the sort of story at the time. But this, in the early days, going into the first lockdown, the event organisers using Hopin were saying, we particularly like the networking element. It had this speed networking thing. But we think the sponsor booths are crap. Now, if I was Hopin, that's super useful stuff to know. And then even more than that, because people are speaking, talking in these communities, you have intent data, and particularly buying signals. So this was, in fact, it's funny that they're just literally there. This was asked in our community of event organisers, has anyone tried out the Hubbelow digital events platform? Interested to hear how it compares to similar platforms like AirMeet. And then you have all sorts of people replying to that. That's like gold dust for these people here. Same, questions that get asked in these community tease out needs which help for content, but also, say, for transaction, for buying. So finally then, just a few helpful resources. To say, if you want a copy of this, then either come up afterwards, give me your business card, connect with me on LinkedIn or on Guild. But this community I mentioned where we got that data we came from, which is for events organisers, used to be called CREO, as I say. We set it up originally as we went into the, it was stood for Coronavirus Response for Event Organisers. It's now called Events+365. But if you're work in the events industry, you're welcome to join. There's over 1,000 people in it. But it's a peer support community for people working in events. We've also got, and hopefully you best sort of Google this. I mean, if you Google Events+365 Guild, it should come up. How to combine events with community. There's just a much more like a best practice guide. Again, if you Google that, it should come up. And community-based marketing. So again, I talked about some marketing things, but how can you use marketing, how can you use community to drive marketing outcomes as an event organizer or say for data and things like that. So that's it. I think we have 5 minutes left if there are any digitally submitted questions or in-person questions.
All right, I think we got first question over here.
Thank you for that, really interesting. I work for a member association, so we've kind of been doing these community things for the past couple of years. Sort of a bit of a victim of our own success though, where they've gotten so big, they no longer really feel like communities. And for instance, we have a WhatsApp group. People want to use that to share maybe quite, sensitive information on them. What would you recommend about how to make it still feel like a community when those groups have gotten so big and sometimes they just don't feel like opening up about what's going on in their organization and industry because there's so many unknown faces amongst them?
Did everyone hear that on the magic headphones? Okay. So you're a membership association, yes, and the question is how in community gets too big or too impersonal, people start to maybe not be quite so open and honest. I mean, there's a number of things to that. Firstly, well, we at Guild believe that having some kind of being present as yourself, having a profile and being known is important because it encourages better behavior. So in certain platforms, including WhatsApp, but Telegram, Signal, Slack to a lesser degree, you don't know who the other people are, which sometimes doesn't matter if the content you're getting is good enough, but it does mean that, well, there's no moderation. Bad things can happen and there's nothing you can do about it. So I think having people, having some kind of actual identity actually is quite important. The flip side to that is sometimes people therefore worry about posting because it's not anonymous, so sometimes they engage because they don't feel judged because no one knows who they are. So there's a lot of, more like gaming things like Discord and various platforms where people are pretty much anonymous. And they want it that way, or crypto trading, gaming, developers, as in engineers, software engineers, often don't like, they would rather be anonymous. And that's a generalization, but so I think different sorts of communities want different levels of anonymity or not. But certainly having actual identities prevents bad behavior in my view, or the worst of it anyway. I think also, if the community gets too big, you need to sort of prune it or cull people potentially to shrink it back down again, or you create specialist groups, like special interest groups. It was big, SIGs in a membership world, or so you might have a general community that's bigger and broader, but then you have more focused subgroups or specialist communities around a particular seniority or geography or special interest and things. So there are ways then that you could still keep the intimacy in the smaller groups and have maybe a larger, broad one. So yeah, I think it's and then it's just active, curation and moderation really. So I mean, it's if you and engagement, keeping engagement up through things like events, both virtual and physical, video, sessions online. So not just maybe text and pictures and things. So there's all sorts of ways, and this is where it comes not so much about the technology, but about the community hosting and moderation and management. There is a skill to that, So I think somebody who's good at that can keep the community alive. Sometimes you need to be brave and shut the community down and say it served its purpose. It was here for a certain amount of time, and now we don't need it anymore. We're creating it's creating 5 specialist groups rather than one general one or something. So I think, what you're saying does happen, and it just needs to be kind of actively managed.
Did that answer your question? Perfect. Do we have any other questions from the audience? None that I can see. I have one question actually, because I think with communities and social media, etc., the ways that you communicate around your community can sometimes feels a bit overwhelming because we have so many different communities we're a part of, or channels that therefore is communicated to you. So I personally kind of switch off because I can't deal with the information overload. How would you combat that? Like, what would you recommend to do to sort of like really keep your community engaged?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sort of semantics thing here a little bit, where personally I'd say that most public social media, which is where you get most of the overwhelmingness, they're not really communities. Like, so in lots of social media you have what I would say are fans or followers, and the relationship is sort of pretty much one-to-many. So there's a person on Twitter or a brand who you are following who radiates stuff out to you, basically. And then you have audiences, which is again one-to-many. Publishers tend to be this, so they go, here's my content. Event organisers a bit, here's my event. It's still basically one-to-many. And that means it can be very noisy, particularly in public social media, because anyone can access it. Whereas a community kind of has to be many-to-many, so there's a sort of peer-to-peer element in it. I mean, a network is slightly different again, I would say. But so I think there is a move, because of the problems you highlighted, which is mostly in public social media, towards people are kind of retrenching back to slightly more private, smaller, curated spaces. Most obviously that's happening in WhatsApp, actually. Slack and, something. But in terms of what most people will know, it's like something which is not public. And that might be sort of friends and family, it might be smaller groups and teams. There are groups and indeed even communities running on WhatsApp now. It has some upsides, but of course plenty of downsides. And Guild is pretty much basically a business version or a professional version of WhatsApp. So I think people are anyway doing what you're saying, and they're seeking out smaller groups. We have a guy on our advisory board called Robin Dunbar, Professor Robin Dunbar, who's famous for the Dunbar number. And it basically says that we as humans can't really know more than about 150 people. Some people it's a bit more, some people it's a bit less, but it's just not possible to know thousands of people. It's a limitation of our brain. So, when we're in these communities, if I'm in a LinkedIn group with 13,412 people, that isn't a community. I mean, it's not even really a very effective group either, actually. Same with Slack, same with a lot of these things. I don't think they are true communities then, when they get too big. So interestingly, on Guild, the average size of the group's 130, and that's not, we haven't done anything, it just naturally, we have some in the thousands, low thousands, we don't have any in the tens of thousands or something, because it just becomes a bit anonymous to the point. So I think that the trend is, and this is back to when we, tribal, it's always been this way, it's always been true, that actually we exist in quite small communities, our village, our neighborhood, our colleagues at work or whatever, our friends and family. So I think it's just that public social media and indeed digital channels of communication, including email, they're the things that have given us that sense of overload.
Thank you. That made that clear. It was probably more a network than a community, right? Any last questions? No. Ashley, thank you so very much for that. That was very interesting. And thank you all for joining.